The Crimes and Passions of John Stabberger by John Baltisberger. Hindenburg II. What you deserve.
Why are you doing this?
Because you're a fucking Nazi, and you don't deserve fuck all else, Stabberger replied offhandedly. He wasn't putting too much thought into his reply. He wasn't really paying attention to the conversation. It was hard to focus on removing a gallbladder while having to listen to this scumbag and hold him still all at the same time. The kid, he was probably 19, bucked under him. He pulled the knife out and Stabberger punched the kid in the skull with his free hand. Hard enough to daze him, hard enough to make him whine, but not hard enough to knock him out. Stabberger didn't want that. He wanted the punk ass to feel everything. Satisfied that the little asshole was going to stay still for now, Stabberger sat back from where he was straddling that man's ass on the alley pavement. But maybe you don't mean why am I cutting you. Maybe you mean why am I cutting you here. Stabberger slid the knife back into the slit of skin. The boy whimpered again, but he didn't struggle, his head still ringing. He felt the pain, but couldn't muster the strength needed to buck Stabberger off. It's not all that complicated. See, here. He slid the knife around, wiggling it to widen the slit in the man's skin a bit. This is just above where your gallbladder is. Stabberger used his other hand and slid a finger into the slice he had made. He hooked his finger up, pulling the skin taut. He could feel the jelly of the Nazi's fat squelch. He wiggled his finger, each wiggle stretching the hole in the man's skin. The boy was shaking. The pain was clearing his head. Stabberger pushed hard, forcing his entire hand under the man's skin. He flexed his arm, tearing upward. The sound of the boy's skin separating from muscle and fat was like music to his ears. The Nazi howled into the night, screaming in animal fear and pain. The smell of his blood almost overpowered the scent of his shit-filled pants. Stabberger pulled his bloody hand out of the boy's backskin and hammered his fist into the boy's skull again. It knocked his face back down into the concrete and piss-filled potholes of the dirty alley, outside the shithole bar he had spotted the kid coming out of. They can't hear you, Nazi, not over their music. Just you and me. He paused and looked down at his work. Still so much to do. He pulled the skin up with one hand and started using the knife to cut the skin away into strips that he tossed aside. And you may be wondering, why the gallbladder? He spoke loudly over the sound of the boy's screams and the music. Well, without a gallbladder, you can't eat greasy fried foods. You can't process them that well. He tore the last of the boy's back away and stared down at the soft muscles and layers of grotesque off-yellow fat. And by the look of things, you really enjoy your french fries, fatty. Stabberger leaned back in and cut through what could loosely be called muscle and meat, to dig up and under the ribs. He was not careful, and his blade sliced through the liver tissue as he found the little greenish organ. Stabberger reached in and grabbed the organ, looping his fingers through the veins and tubes that connected it to his body and yanked hard, ripping and pulling the thing out through sheer savagery. He studied the thing for a moment before tossing it aside and looking down. Stabberger tilted his head, listening to the sobs. With a growl, he rose and kicked the little fascist porker in the side, forcing his body to roll over. The screaming rose in pitch as the boy's skinless back scraped against the rough pavement, mingling his blood and juices with the piss and stagnant water. Are you crying? He looked down at the Nazi in disgust. His shaved head and nose ring were typical enough of these skinheads, but that hadn't been enough to condemn the boy. It was the 1488 tattoo on his neck, his All Lives Matter shirt. Those mattered. Those condemned the boy. You are crying. He looked back at the boy's face, swollen from the initial greeting headbutt Stabberger had delivered, puffy and red from crying. The snot bubbled from his nose, catching in the sparse, puby mustache he sported. You little bitch. You little fucking pussy. Aren't you the master race? Aren't you superior? Ich bin Jüdisch.
Please don't hurt me anymore.
The overweight bully blabbered, his misshapen man titties jiggling as he sobbed. Stabberger considered cutting his tits off, but he was so disgusted by the little skinhead's blubbering that he couldn't bear to listen to the coward any longer. He lifted his knife above his head and plunged it down, ripping through sallow pale skin and sparse chest hair. Sliding through loose muscle tissue, the blade shattered his ribs before digging into the meat of his fatty heart. Stabberger leaned forward, putting his weight on the blade. He twisted the knife, tearing the flesh apart, ignoring the gouts of blood that squirted up into his face. They were weak, anemic sprays. Too much blood was coming out of the back in an ever-growing puddle under the two of them. The boy bucked in his death spasms, convulsing wildly under Stabberger, but he didn't mind, and he wasn't thrown off. He pulled out the blade and carved a swastika on the boy's other pec, so that everyone would know why he had been carved up. Before sliding down to engrave "All Nazis must die" in the boy's stomach. Stabberger got up. He was coated in gore, and looked at his handiwork, satisfied. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a plea for the supremacists to change their ways. It was too late for that. It was a message. He was coming for them. The diner. The diner was mostly empty at this time of night, and this part of town. New Sodom was one of the worst cities in America for crime. On the border of Louisiana and Texas, the massive coastal city had attracted the worst bits from every stratum of life. As these things go, the city was quickly divided up by social standing and economic status. Ruth's diner was not in a good part of town. The parking lot had seen its fair share of drug deals and murders and quick fumbling fucks between the local prostitutes and their johns. Ruth herself didn't give two shits what happened. The cops never came to this part of town, and she made a good enough breakfast and was good enough shot with the .22 behind the counter that even the meanest banger was loath to cross her. She ran the diner like it was her own fiefdom in a sea of anarchy, and it might as well have been. She worked the counter while her second and fourth husband, Duncan Douglas McClother IV, stood behind the grill and prepared the few food orders that came in. Ruth's 3 daughters, from 4 marriages, worked various hours, each taking their turn as waitress between second jobs or school. Today, all 3 were in the diner, sitting together at a table, talking about things young women discussed, though only one of them was on the clock. "Esther," Ruth barked from her place on the counter, her eyes dark and cold, surveying her kingdom. Esther jumped in, surprised at the son's sound. "Yes, ma'am?" she said, her southern drawl a stark contrast to her mother's angry New Jersey accent. "You got a customer. Your boyfriend's back." Esther turned bright red as Ruth pointed out the bloody specter that had entered near silently and sat down at one of the booths. "Ain't my boyfriend, Ma," she said. Only, she said it as a whisper so she wouldn't catch a hand for her back talking. She looked at her sisters, who all grinned up at her. She would never live it down. Truth was, the figure that had come in was mighty handsome. He looked like he had been cut from glass in an attempt to remake the David, but where Michelangelo's statue was soft, beautiful, kind, and human, Stabberger was hard and mean, grizzled and inhuman in a strange way. He carried a darkness in him that went beyond his bloody deeds. That, and the bulge in Stabberger's pants hinted that his sculptor had been a bit more generous than Michelangelo. "He looks even raggier than usual," her older sister teased. "You like him rough, huh, Esther?" "Shut up, Melissa." "I heard he was born with knives for hands," her younger sister added. "Well, look at him, Rose," Esther ordered. "Okay." "Do you see hands or knives?" Melissa asked. "Hands," Rose admitted with some disappointment. She had liked the idea of a crime fighter with knife hands. Despite her earlier protest, Esther straightened her dress and apron, checked her makeup, and approached the booth, grabbing a mug and a carafe of coffee on her way. "Shalom, Esther." His tight curly hair bobbed as he nodded to her. The trench coat wrapped tight around his body was caked in blood, the booth already filthy with grime and viscera he dragged in. Hiya, John," she said, setting the cup down and filling it. A quick glance, and she saw that the floors were streaked too. He emptied the napkin holder, trying to clean his hands of the thick fluid. "Hard night?" "For some." His eyes were nearly black with how dark they were. He offered her a small smile. It was unnatural for him, but it was real. There was a kindness in that smile that so few in this world ever got to see from him, or that was ever offered to her. Despite herself and the horror of his appearance, she felt butterflies in her stomach. "You want your usual?" "Depends on who's cooking." "Daddy." John Stabberger grunted. It was late, or rather, it was early, and he had plans. He couldn't spend all night here, or rather, on the shitter, which is where her dad's cooking would land him. "Nah then, just the coffee." He leaned back and closed his eyes. "Thanks." "Sure thing, you just call me if you need anything." "Will do, Esther, will do." He listened to her retreat to the table with her sisters and took a deep breath. After a moment, he felt the shadow fall across him. He could feel irritation coming off the shadow in waves. "Ruth," he said, without opening his eyes. "You gonna clean this fucking mess, John?" "No." "You can't come in here all fucking bloody and expect everything to be funky hunky-dory, John." Stabberger opened an eye and looked at the angry woman at the foot of his booth. "My money ain't good enough for you?" "Your money's fine, but the extra work ain't." "Well, I tip extra well," he countered, and it was true. He always left a surreal amount of money for the diner. One reason he was tolerated, and probably one reason that the girls liked waiting on him. Though Ruth would be an idiot if she pretended not to know that the girls were interested in his other large tip as well. "Yeah, and where does that money come from, John?" While Ruth knew every single one of her clients was a criminal, she took more interest in the man her daughter was falling over herself over. "Dead Nazis. I figured they took our gold and our homes, tit for tat." Ruth digested this information for a moment. She had lost her grandpa to the camps. Her parents still shared their horror stories. "And where do you find all these dead Nazis so you can be so generous?" John Stabberger grinned up at her. No kindness in the smile this time, only a sublime joy. "I make 'em." The party. When Stabberger left the diner, he left a pool of blood in the seat and all the contents from the wallet he had taken off the slimy Nazi fuck he killed earlier. Now, he stood on the edge of the trailer park watching a party rage within its boundaries. Some shitty local punk band was screaming its head off on a makeshift stage. In the pit, elbows were flying as skinheads skanked around trying to show they had more cred than anyone else, and they can't dance or interact with another UN department. The party consisted of cheap beer and a cooler, the band, enough meth to start a new business venture, and about 20 skinheads. Well, 19. Number 20 lay in the gutter with no backskin. Stabberger drew 2 hunting knives from under his coat and stalked into the shadows of the trailer park. The soundtrack of his work could be better. He preferred the dulcet tones of zeal and ardor as he cut through flesh of white supremacists. Still, the angry, incoherent ramblings of a bullshit punk band that was singing about how great fascism was would have to do. Stabberger wondered how a group could call itself punk when all it really wanted to do was gargle on the nuts of the government. He found a man in the shadows. Maybe he was a guard, but he was distracted. He stood there, his back to Stabberger, his hand frantically jerking his tiny little dick.
"Shut the fuck up, Lizzie. Stop laughing."
The Peckerwood growled, trying to get his limp dick to respond.
"I fucking paid you, so you'll wait until I get hard so you can suck it."
The girl in question had her head shaved too, except for purple bangs. She was on her knees, herpes-coated lips turned up in a condescending smile at the fact that her $15 paramour couldn't get it up. Stabberger stepped behind the man and reached around, cutting his dick off with one knife and stabbing him in the shoulder with the other knife. He took a step back and pummeled the man's lungs with the blades, sliding the knives between each rib expertly like he was trying to debone the meth head. The man couldn't scream. He had no oxygen left in his perforated lungs. The girl, Lizzie, could scream, and she did. Her face had gotten the money shot she had been paid for, though it was a bit bloodier than she had been expecting. The few inches of meat had fallen between her knees. Blood geysered into her eyes with every slowing beat of his heart. His loose and foul balls jiggled as the man fell sideways to continue his dickless blood orgasms as he died. The girl's screams mingled with the girlish shriek of the lead singer. No one noticed. Some men had codes against killing women and children, but to Stabberger, a Nazi was a Nazi, no matter what they had between their legs or what they liked between their lips. He stepped past the dying man and rammed his blade into Lizzie's mouth. The blade tore her lips apart as the handguard shattered her teeth. Her eyes went wide while the blade tip tore through the back of her throat and severed her spinal cord as it burst out the back of her neck. She gargled through shattered teeth and lacerated tongue. Her eyes focused as best they could on the man that had buried the knife in her face. She'd always known a John would kill her. She just didn't figure it would be this John. Or this painful. She died seconds later, drowning on blood. John put a boot on her face and kicked her corpse off the knife. Stabberger moved forward, getting ready for the real melee, but paused as the music came to a stop. He stood in the shadows. He wasn't scared, didn't have a second doubt, but it would be easier to kill if he entered the fray during the chaos of music. So he waited, hoping they weren't about to disperse. The whole reason he came here was so he could make short work of the large group without having to stalk the streets.
Okay, everyone, settle the fuck down. As you all know, we're celebrating.
There was a loud roar from the chuckle-fuck bigots as they patted each other on the back of whatever circle-jerk victory they had won.
Air dong holders devices worked. We have brought back a hero. As soon as we're done here, we'll head to the docks where Charles fucking Lindbergh himself will board the newly constructed Hindenburg II and will storm the White House for the Fuhrer.
Another roar went up as the inbred fuck whistles raised their arms in Nazi salutes at the brilliance of their plan. A bunch of Texas cousin fucking meth heads were going to storm the White House with their White Claw and their shitty varmint pea shooters. They thought they could take on the Secret Service and the president's paramilitary guards. They would all be dead before morning. Well, that was happening no matter what. Stabberger didn't give two fucks worth of shit if these stupid motherfuckers thought they could do it. He also didn't care for President Sniffy McTouch-Touch. As far as he was concerned, every politician could be fed into a wood chipper and mulched for fertilizer for the weed farms. But he wasn't going to let the U.S. government steal kills from him. The Nazis were still shouting "Heil!" over and over again as Stabberger climbed to the top of the nearest RV and took a running leap off the edge. He sailed over the crowd, coming down on the singer who had been pumping up the crowd, the two knives slamming into his shoulder. Stabberger's weight and momentum tore through the tendon and bone and ripped the limbs away. As he finished standing, Stabberger rose and swung both knives into the armless stinger's stomach. The force lifted the man off his feet. Stabberger twisted to fling the bleeding torso of the man into the crowd below the stage, who were already screaming and reaching for their weapons. Stabberger ignored them. He threw one of his knives into the drummer's chest and turned towards the guitarist. The man was swinging his guitar at Stabberger's head. John ducked under the makeshift axe. "You fight like you play," Stabberger growled as he slammed the knife into the man's neck, jerking it hard through the tendons and ripping his throat out. "And your playing fucking sucks." He turned, checking to make sure the drummer was still choking on his own blood that welled up through the chest from the knife wound. He was. But by that point, more and more of the scrawny shitheads were climbing up on stage to challenge him. Stabberger turned, a maniacal smile plastered on his face. There was no high like the high he got from stabbing Nazis right in their white power tattoos. They came at him in a clump, each one eager to prove they were Ubermensch. Stabberger didn't care. He knew each was a pathetic excuse for a cowardly piece of shit. He gladly welcomed the oncoming cluster of pallid, sweaty flesh, plunging his knife into the stomach of the nearest meth head. He tore the blade out sideways, spilling the man's intestines all over the stage before he turned and caught the next fuckwit in the armpit. He twisted the knife, ripping through flesh, muscle, and digging into the chest cavity as he went. Stabberger jerked forward, pain exploding through his back. He staggered a few feet as the hunting knife fell from numb fingers. Someone had gotten him in the back with a switchblade. It stuck out almost comically, like a long pin jutting from a voodoo doll. The skinheads were still screaming, trying to psych themselves up in an attempt to save the man who was still trying to shove his guts back in the ragged hole Stabberger had torn in him. They assumed that the knife-crazed Jewish ambusher would die. He didn't. With a slurp, the blade sticking out of his back was sucked into his body, absorbed entirely. Stabberger stood up straight and swung around, flinging his arm like he was throwing a baseball. The switchblade, the same one he had been stabbed with seconds ago, slid from his flesh, rocketing out of his palm like it had been fired from a t-shirt cannon directly into the eye of a girl who was crying out her dying brother's name. An expression of confusion came across her features as she tried to look at the knife in her eye. She died with the stupidest cross-eyed look on her stupid face. There was silence for a second as the partygoers realized Stacy was no longer screaming and turned to look at the man they thought they had killed. Stabberger held his hand out, letting them watch as the sawback machete blades slid from his forearms. The metal cut through flesh, and blood flowed freely from Stabberger's arms. He paused a moment, letting them take in the vision of their death. Then he was among them. He leapt into the crowd, his arm swinging. He sliced through the jugular of a young man on his right before pistoning his left arm blade into the skull of an elderly punk rocker on his left. Stepping back, he pulled his arms free and then came forward again, sweeping both arms in a wide arc that tore the jaw off one man, the throat out of a second man, and slit the nipples of a tall, muscular man who had the ill fortune of not wearing a shirt. Stabberger twisted his arms, returning for another swipe, but the man with the split nips stepped inside his reach and grabbed Stabberger by the throat. Gasping for breath, Stabberger swung his right arm in a tight circle, cutting off the meathead's hand and then slamming his other blade through the man's sternum and out of his back. Stabberger snapped the blade off, leaving it buried in the man's chest. The rest were running. That was fine. Stabberger jumped down off the stage, rolling and swinging his bladed limb through the ankle of a middle-aged woman in a Ronald Reagan shirt. He slammed the blade through her torso as he used it to push himself off the ground, and he let the machete slide from his body, leaving it impaled through the woman and pinning her to the ground. As he ran after the next victim in sight, Stabberger reached into his coat and pushed his fingers into his own chest, sliding past muscle to grab the handle of a large cleaver. He pulled the massive blade out of his chest and took a deep breath as everything sealed back up. He reached back and then threw the knife. It soared end over end and embedded itself in the back of a man's skull, splitting his eagle tattoo right in half. Stabberger didn't slow down at all. He reached down to grab the handle and wrench it free, dragging what passed for brains and Nazi shitfucker skulls out and onto the pavement as he passed. He saw several of them run into a trailer. They were attempting to barricade themselves inside. That was fine. Stabberger slammed the cleaver into the wall of the trailer, and joined the yelps of fright as he searched the ground. It didn't take long for him to find what he was looking for, a half-empty bottle of Everclear. He grabbed the nearby Confederate flag and ripped the strip off it, jamming it into the bottle and using his Zippo to light the end. He preferred to stab Nazis, but he didn't mind using a Molotov cocktail when the situation warranted it. He lobbed the makeshift incendiary through a window, the sound of crackling, tinkling, and glass music to his ears. Roaring flames burst within the small trailer. He grabbed his cleaver and moved towards the door, ready to greet any fleeing punks as they came out.
"Oh shit, the lab is on fire!"
came the frantic shouts from inside. Lab? Meth lab. Stabberger turned to get away from the trailer, but the explosion ripped through the building and swept him up, throwing him full force into the wall of the next trailer over. A mushroom cloud of bright orange and yellow flame lit the sky, throwing the blood-soaked carnage of the trailer park into clear contrast. Stabberger groaned, trying to peel himself off the ground. Flaming body parts fell from the sky, a shower of viscera added to the already gory night. Stabberger counted the limbs as they fell. There was a head, and that hairy fat arm didn't match the head, and that torso had pert tits and a Tweety bird tattoo just above the missing pelvis, so it was probably a woman. At least 3 then. He would assume just 3. That meant there were only 3 more. Despite the ringing in his ears, Stabberger heard a motor cough and sputter. A horrible old Volkswagen was trying to start. They were trying to flee the scene. That simply wouldn't do. He stumbled a few steps, his equilibrium thrown off by the explosion, and then paused to find the cleaver he had been carrying. He found it and then turned back towards the parking lot. The car was still struggling to turn over. He wondered how panicked they were. The fear they felt was just a taste of what they had spent their lives spreading. Now their lives were swiftly depreciating currency, and his knife was the Wall Street collapse that would bankrupt them. He jumped the fence and landed on the back of the car. They were screaming. 3 of them, by his count. That was the last of this little shindig shitfuckers. The car roared to life finally and started to move. Stabberger slammed the cleaver into the roof of the VW and reached into his coat, pulling out a long chef knife. Using the chopper for leverage and to steady himself on the car, Stabberger crawled across the hood and positioned himself before kicking savagely into the rear window with his steel-toed boots.
They were suitable for glass and for stomping Nazi balls into a fine paste. He kicked again and again. He could hear their screaming even through the sound of the engine and the wind roaring past him. After his fifth kick, he felt the glass crumple and give. It stayed in one sheet, safety glass put together by car manufacturers tired of being sued. Didn't matter. John didn't need the glass to cut. He would take care of that part. He let go of the quiver and let the momentum of the car carry him backward. He fell off the roof and onto the trunk. He used his chef knife, slamming it into the metal, halting his slide. He flung his other hand back, letting a large sashimi knife slice through the flesh of his arms, and caught it by the handle, before bringing it back around. The skinheads inside fumbled to retrieve their guns and shoot at him, but their panic and car full of broken glass was hampering them. Stabberger pulled himself closer and jammed the long, thin knife through the broken window and into the chest of a Nazi in the right back seat. He used the leverage to pull out the chef knife and stab it higher into the trunk, giving himself more room to work. The back of the car didn't have any grip, and so Stabberger slid as he tried to steady himself, the knife tip inside the skinhead sliding around through organs and gristle as Stabberger adjusted. Ripping the blade out, Stabberger almost lost his balance, but caught himself and thrust forward instead, slamming the tip of his knife through the throat of the hysterical woman who was sobbing something about being sorry and sparing her. Stabberger pushed forward, spearing the blade through the back of the driver's seat headrest and into the driver's skull. The car swerved as the driver lost control of his fine and blunt motor skills, his bowels, his vision, and his autonomic functions all at once. Stabberger tried to maintain his grip on the two knives, but as the car hit a curve and vaulted over the sidewalk, tumbling in the air, Stabberger was finally thrown clear. He stood and watched the vehicle tumble past the parked cars and motorcycles, crunching as it rolled. 3 corpses were smashed into a fine fascist paste. Finally, the devastated vehicle came to a stop against a shipping container full of industrial-grade grappling hooks. He nodded, satisfied. That was everyone at the party, and the car had crashed just outside the docks, his next stop. He just needed to find the Zeppelin and... He stared up, his mind stalling as he watched the massive dirigible rising above the shipping containers. Scratch that. He needed to get on that airship. Hindenburg II. The motorcycle roared as Stabberger pushed it to its limits through the city streets. His ragged trenchcoat flapped behind him as he swerved between cars and obstacles, his eyes on the shape floating above the city's buildings. He needed to catch up and figure out a way to board it. His eyes returned to the road as he zipped past pedestrians, cars, and trucks. Stabberger didn't have a plan. He never had a plan. All he had was a body full of knives and a heart full of hate. Stabberger saw an opportunity, and he took it. Swinging his bike into the next lane, he gunned the engine and pushing every ounce of horsepower he could from the roaring machine. He advanced on the back of an empty car carrier transport and popped the wheelie, bringing the front wheel down on the ramp. Gunning the engine once more, he accelerated up the car transport's ramp and rocketed off the top end, propelling himself and the motorcycle up and over the street. He slammed into a building's reinforced glass window with the front wheel, forcing the window out of its mounting. He landed with a thud inside the office building. A janitor stood there, mouth agape, as the Jewish writer crashed to the floor. Stabberger stood and pulled the bike off the floor, checking to make sure it wasn't damaged.
You okay, man?
The old janitor asked.
Yup. You ain't supposed to ride motorcycles in here.
It was a ridiculous statement, but what else could he say?
I'm gonna have to clean all this up.
Stabberger looked at the old man. He looked like a decent enough sort, the kind of man who had lived his entire life slaving away for other people, believing that honest hard work would be rewarded, only to realize that as his body ached every morning, that unless he could go back in time to be born rich and white, nothing he did would ever let him reach the status of comfort the men in the top 4 offices had.
Yeah.
Stabberger glanced around and grabbed the piece of Globo sham stationery off a nearby table.
What's your name?
Raoul Wallace, sir. Stabberger scrawled the name on the stationery and then nodded at the mess.
Sorry. Then he mounted the bike and gunned it back into action, revving the engine twice before taking off down the long row of cubicles. He had wasted enough time taking the man's name. Too much time on kindness. Fucking kindness was never its own reward, and no good deed went unpunished. He pushed the bike harder. He reached into his coat, grabbing an axe. Not his typical style, but perfect for the moment. He reared back and flung the axe forward. It tumbled end over end as it flew from Stabberger's hand and slammed into the window ahead of him, shattering the safety glass and giving him a clear path out the window of the 4-story drop below. Or it would be a 4-story drop if there wasn't a crane just outside the building for him to jump to, a symptom of the never-ending construction happening in the swiftly gentrifying city of New Sodom. Stabberger landed on the crane's arm and rode up the thin rail, racing into the night sky. He was near the dirigible. It was right there. He slowed a smidge and then gunned it, trying to time his jump perfectly. At the last second, he reached down to grab the grappling hook he had stolen from the docks, and leapt from the seat of the motorcycle as it launched from the crane and through the night air. He twisted in midair, took aim, and fired the grappling hook. The bladed claw of the device shot forward and embedded itself in the massive balloon of the Zeppelin. Stabberger slammed his finger on the retract button and found himself zipping toward his prey. He watched the oncoming window with a scowl. He was getting tired of windows. Maybe once all the Nazis were dead, he would move on to windows, starting with this one. He swung on the rope and crashed through the window feet first, rolling as he hit the ground and popping up. In his hands he held 2 long jagged pieces of broken glass. The ragged edges dug into his palms, blood dripping to his feet. If he had any time, he would have wrapped the knives in some fabric to make handles, but he was out of time, and patience. A dozen men stood staring at Stabberger in shock. Each wore a gray uniform emblazoned with symbols of the Third Reich, eagles and S's, lightning bolts and swastikas, like they were having a little dress-up party. Stabberger charged forward, already swinging the makeshift weapons as he moved. He rammed into the first SS fanboy he came across and slammed his shoulder into the man, bringing both glass shards up and into the man's kidneys. As he screamed, Stabberger pulled the glass shards from his first victim and twirled like a beautiful blood-drenched bearded ballerina to jam one shard in a man's eye socket and bring the other into a man's throat. Now coated in blood and eyeball juices, the makeshift weapons were too slick to hold, so he left the glass embedded in the 2 Goebbels groupies and moved on. As he swung around to face the next Nazi in line, he realized the rest of them were drawing weapons, pulling guns out, a coward's tool. But Stabberger didn't care. He flexed, 2 ulu knives ripping from the back of his hands, severing tendons and carving flesh as they emerged, only for the skin to heal back up. Stabberger wielded the blades like punch daggers and charged through the men once again, ducking and weaving as he moved. A crushed sternum there, a chopped eye socket here, a punch with enough force to decapitate a Nazi there. Bullets whizzed through the air, and Stabberger laughed as some of the Nazis began whining in high-pitched screams about using a gun on a hydrogen-filled dirigible. He didn't stop moving as he laughed. He killed 4 more men in a heartbeat before throwing one of the Ulus to catch a fleeing man in the base of the neck, paralyzing him. He wouldn't be able to run, but he wasn't dead. He would get to watch the second crash of the Hindenburg. 1 more man remained. The Zeppelin was beginning to sink into the night sky. With no one steering the behemoth, the skyship would soon catch on a building, and then history would repeat itself.
Lindbergh, I presume?
Stabberger approached the last standing Nazi. The blond man with the oddly shaped head and blue eyes cowered, tripping over himself to get away from the maniac with the knives. Stabberger reached back into his coat and brought out a long, thin stiletto and lunged forward, stabbing through Lindbergh's leg and pinning him to the floor. He straddled the scrawny man's chest, pushing his weak Nazi arms away as Lindbergh tried to fight him off.
Say hello to your bullshit wife in hell for me,
Stabberger growled, punching Lindbergh in the face. The ulu cut through the man's jaw, widening his smile as he screamed, blood and teeth gushing out of the wound like a flood. Stabberger punched again and again, working the blade through the meat and bone, slicing through the tendons that held his little Nazi skull together until he had to lean forward and put real weight into the punches to get through the spine. Stabberger stood and grabbed Lindbergh's now mostly headless corpse and tossed it out of the nearest window. He watched it fall toward the earth and then looked around. He grabbed the fattest Nazi corpse and took a running leap out of the Zeppelin, riding the fat-ass corpse all the way to the top of the nearest building. There, he stood and watched as the marvel of Nazi ineptitude crashed into the National Bank of America building in a bright fireball. Satisfied, Stabberger turned and made his way to the fire escape. Later. The next day, Stabberger was back at Ruth's diner. He had showered and changed. There was only so much blood stink a person could take after all, and he didn't like sleeping in gore. Luckily, this time Ruth was in the kitchen, prepping food that would actually taste good and not cause him to shit his entire skeleton out of his body. He was just enjoying his hash browns and coffee when Esther sat in the booth across from him. She slapped the newspaper down. On the front page was a picture of the dirigible carnage from last night, as well as images from the party he had broken up. The headline read, "The Nazi Annihilator Strikes Again." "Is this you, John?" she asked. Stabberger looked from the paper to the young Jewish woman accusing him of being him. He nodded, picking up the paper.
"Has a nice ring to it."
Her eyes widened, not because she was surprised, but because she was surprised he admitted it so readily. She stammered a little, unsure of what to say now. He took a long pull of the coffee, reached into his coat, and pulled out some crumpled and blood-stained dollars before rising.
"You want to go catch a movie?"
She gaped at him. "What?"
"Dollar movie theater," he said, offering his arm to her. "Showing Inglorious Bastards. Do you want to come with me?"
"Are you asking me on a date? After this?" she asked, lifting the paper to his face.
"Yup."
After you killed men!" she exclaimed in a tight whisper.
"No,"
he said, pushing the paper down and reaching a hand around her waist to pull her close.
"They weren't men. They were Nazis. Now, are you coming?"
She looked at him, so close she could almost feel the tickle of his beard against her cheek. It made her feel warm inside. He had a point. Who cares about Nazis? She found she couldn't speak, so she just nodded and let him lead her out of the diner.